take a look at Chapter 32, Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand. If I can advance the slide here. Aggregate demand is total expenditures in an economy, all the expenditures, total demand. Aggregate supplies, total production, all the production. So when we look at a graph of aggregate demand, we see a downward sloping curve, only instead of prices and quantity, we have price level, which is absence or presence of inflation, and real domestic output, GDP, quantity of real GDP. And obviously at a higher price level, that erodes savings balances, so people have less in income to spend. Also, a higher price level means more dollars are needed to purchase goods. So the money available to borrow becomes more scarce and interest rates go up. Interest rates and inflation rates move in parallel. Right now we have low interest rates and low inflation. So what shifts this aggregate demand curve? And I want you to pay attention in your text to page 639, the green box on that page. Determinants of aggregate demand, these shift the entire aggregate demand curve to the right or to the left. Right increase, left decrease. But looking at the shifting factors, consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports, that is what we learned in chapter 27, I believe it was. Those make up GDP, total GDP, consumer spending, investment, business spending, government spending, and then net exports. And then when any one of those changes through that multiplier effect, the GDP can increase dramatically or decrease dramatically. Right now, this is March 2020, we're concerned with the coronavirus pandemic. Consumption is down dramatically. Obviously, investment is down as well. So the government has come in with stimulus programs to try to increase aggregate demand and spend a lot of money, giving people money, helping out businesses that are hurt, and so on. So again, look at that green box that tells you the separate things specifically, and we're going to talk about them a little bit now. Increases in aggregate demand move the curve to the right, decreases to the left. Ideally, we'd like aggregate supply and aggregate demand to both increase at the same time, and we'll see why. But let's look at consumer spending, consumer wealth, household borrowing, consumer expectations. If people are optimistic about the economy, they're more likely to spend money, and tax rates matter. If taxes go up, consumers have less to spend, and GDP can actually decrease. Other changes, investment, interest rates matter. We know that real interest rates are nominal rates minus the inflation rate. That equals the real interest rate. And those have to be positive for banks to make money. Investment spending goes down, obviously, if expectations about future business conditions are not good. Technology matters to investment spending. The more technology available, the more likely businesses are likely to spend on that so that they can get more productivity. If there's a lot of excess capacity, certainly they're not going to expand. Again, right now during this coronavirus pandemic, we're seeing decreases in investment spending. Plants are closing down, at least for the short term, and that's going to negatively impact the economy. Business taxes also matter. Increases in taxes can decrease spending, investment spending. Government spending to increase aggregate demand, increase government spending. As long as interest rates and tax rates don't change, obviously, if you increase taxes to pay for the increase in government spending, then consumption would go down, even though government spending was going up, and you'd really see no change in GDP. The last few bullet points are almost funny. When does government spending ever decrease? It never does. So we'll kind of skip over that one. Theoretically, I guess it could happen. Net export spending, we know exports are only about 13% of our economy. Consumption, investment, and government purchases are more important to our GDP. Having said that, though, dollars appreciation and depreciation does matter. when the US dollar appreciates against other currencies, let's say the euro, which it has been in recent months. If the dollar appreciates against the euro, that makes it more expensive for Europeans to buy our goods. So a little more expensive for exports. It makes it cheaper for us to buy goods from them, and we're likely to have a trade deficit with them for that reason. So looking at aggregate supply, again, another green box on page 645. What shifts the aggregate supply curve? That's total output, total production. And the one we're going to focus on is the short run. Important definition here. The short run is when output prices are flexible, but input prices are fixed. Those inputs are the land, labor, and capital, and entrepreneurship. For example, labor contracts are often fixed for a year or more. So that's an input, that's where the price is fixed. The producers can't change that, but they can change their output prices to reflect that. For example, UPS, some of those Teamsters that work for them have a 5-year contract. So they can't change their contracts, but they could increase or decrease prices to the consumer to make up for that. Obviously, if they don't get enough business, they may have to lay off workers because they cannot obviously decrease their salaries or wages. But the short run aggregate supply curve shifts up to the right. And what can shift it? Determinants of aggregate supply. Again, these are on the green box on page 645. Shifters of the aggregate supply curve that either increase it to the right, decrease it to the left. Let's look at increases, move the curve to the right, again, decreases to the left. But what changes that aggregate supply curve? Input prices, domestic resource prices, land, labor, capital. If the price of labor goes up or capital goes up or land goes up, that's going to decrease the aggregate supply curve. And exchange rates do matter as well, but not as nearly as important as the labor, capital, and land prices domestically. And again, if those labor, capital, and land prices go down, we would likely see an increase in aggregate supply. So wages, if wages go up, that might decrease aggregate supply. Another important factor is productivity. Important definition, real output per unit of input or output per hour, output per worker. And increases in productivity reduce cost, so that increases aggregate supply. Decreases in productivity increase cost, and that will decrease aggregate supply curve. So productivity changes are important to the aggregate supply curve. Other factors that shift the entire curve to the right or left: legal, institutional environment. Taxes can decrease aggregate supply. Taxes on businesses. Subsidies can increase aggregate supply. Again, this being March 2020, and we're in the coronavirus pandemic, government is actually subsidizing businesses by making it easier for them to get short-term loans, low-interest loans, and hoping to increase aggregate supply that way. Regulation is another thing that is very important to aggregate supply. If there is an increase in government regulation, lots of rules and regulations, that will decrease aggregate supply curve because those are costly to comply with. On the other hand, deregulation can increase aggregate supply. And there is a balance, obviously, between too much and too little regulation. So let's look at putting them together. And we're not going to be focusing on the actual numbers there in the box on the right, but just a shift in the curve. Let's say that aggregate demand increases with no changes in aggregate supply. We could expect some inflation. Aggregate demand increasing with no changes in aggregate supply. We'd like to see both of them increasing because that would mean non-inflationary growth. But if we only see increases in aggregate supply, then we could expect to see increases in prices. If we were to see a decrease in aggregate supply, aggregate demand, we might be in a recession. What was happening during the Great Depression in the 1930s were continued decreases in aggregate demand. Some of the reasons for that, there was an increase in the money supply. Banks were being allowed to fail. There was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which cut off international trade. Lots of goods were produced and they couldn't sell them anywhere. Taxes were actually increased during the Great Depression, and there was a lot of pessimism. So that decreased the aggregate demand curve, and we actually saw deflation during the Great Depression. That is the only point of time in our history, about a 4-year period in the 1930s, that the U.S. actually experienced deflation, prices falling. The problem is that incomes were falling faster. So, we think, well, lower prices would be good. Well, not if nobody has a job. Today, we really don't see that prices fall like that. And the reason prices are downwardly inflexible is because there's a fear of price wars. If Delta Airlines reduces their prices, American will follow and meet them, and you have a race to the bottom. Somebody has to agree to raise prices again, and that makes it more difficult. Wage contracts are fixed, so businesses cannot pay lower wages. They may have to lay off workers, though, for that reason. And then, of course, there's the minimum wage law. When minimum wages go up, that means that maybe fewer workers might be hired. So that could decrease aggregate demand if they went up too high, possibly. Decreases in aggregate supply could cause some cost push inflation. That's a per unit input cost. And there is a box on page 645 in the text, that a green box that lists the decreases and increases in aggregate supply reasons. Let's look at some of those. Or if we see increases in aggregate supply and increases in aggregate demand, that would be a good thing. We've actually seen that in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. Aggregate demand has increased, aggregate supply increased, so we've seen a lot of growth in our economy. Aggregate demand is moving a little faster because we have had a little bit of inflation over the past 3 years, but not much, less than 2%. Of course, this being, again, March 2020, and we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, this is not the case, but this did happen in 2017, 18, 19, particularly increases in aggregate demand, increases in aggregate supply, which gave us growth without much inflation. And that's a good thing. That's what we would like to see happen. So when we look at the stimulus and the Great Recession, book's a little old. This is referring to the 2007-2009 housing collapse, which triggered some bank failures, which led to a recession. And then the federal government began the largest peacetime program of spending, probably in history. And this one that the government is getting ready to try to do in 2020 is probably going to be even bigger. The peacetime program of government spending to try to save the economy, because so many businesses have been devastated by the pandemic, and people can't work, consumers aren't spending, we're trying to stay home. So that is going to affect our economy, and we can expect a big government spending program to try to help temper that decrease in GDP. Hopefully we'll come out stronger and the economy will boom after this is over, which hopefully will be soon. Again, let's look back at a couple of things. I want to add perhaps during a recession that we had in the 70s, we had several recessions. That was a lot of that was because of we had some decreases at first in aggregate demand and supply, but the problem with increases in aggregate demand from spending too much or making it too easy to get credit is that that can cause inflation. And in the 70s, we actually had something called stagflation for a while, and that is continued increases in aggregate demand and decreases in aggregate supply. Taxes were high, but it was too easy to get credit. And we also had oil price increases, which decreased aggregate supply. So we had quite a bit of inflation in the 70s, and it was so bad that we called it stagflation. Stagflation definition is an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment rate at the same time. We had never had that happen before, so we had to name it stagflation. And that was happening during the 70s. Fortunately, we haven't had anything like that since. We haven't had any stagflation since then.